Years after my parents and ex-husband destroyed my life, they found me with my baby. Now they want back in, but all I see are the lies that tore me apart. I, a 30-year-old woman, recently found myself face-to-face with my parents and my ex-husband, Scott, a 33-year-old man. I honestly don't know how to feel about this encounter. For context, my parents and I haven't spoken for almost 3 years, and the same goes for my ex-husband. We divorced 3 years ago, and since then, we've had no contact. In fact, I've done everything possible to avoid seeing them again because they practically ruined my life and mental health when I was still with them, to the point where I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. And after my divorce, I moved to the suburbs and tried to build a life for myself, far away from everything and everyone connected to my past. So encountering them recently has been a huge trauma for me. And somehow I said certain things that I'm not sure were the best for me. My parents had always wanted a son, and while they didn't treat me badly growing up, it was very obvious to me that they would have treated me differently if I had been a boy. My mom even mentioned it several times, and I tried to be the son they never had, but I couldn't achieve that. After graduating from college and starting to live on my own, I still tried to stay in touch with my parents because no matter what, they were my family. They were the only family I had since I wasn't particularly close to my grandparents, nor did I have uncles or aunts who were there for me. So I accepted my fate. As much as they pushed me away, they were still my only family. Although they didn't seem very interested in staying in touch with me, I still tried to maintain communication. When I was about 23 years old, I started dating Scott. We met at a concert, and there was an instant spark. After dating for 6 months, I introduced him to my parents, and that's when they started trying harder to stay in touch with me. They called me more often, asked about my relationship, and basically showed more interest in my life. I noticed this change, but since it was a welcome change, I didn't think much of it and just accepted it. The more I dated Scott, the more involved my parents became in my life, and at one point, I felt like we were one big happy family. I was pretty happy about it because it was all I had ever wanted, so I didn't question it, even though I really should have. Anyway, after dating for just over 2 years, we got engaged and then married after being together for 3 years. After getting married, things were pretty good for a while, and I was enjoying my life as a newlywed. But 6 months after the wedding, my parents began hinting that they wanted a grandchild. I was only 26 at the time and wasn't exactly ready. I wanted to wait a couple more years before trying for a baby, but under their insistence, I talked to Scott, and he was in favor of starting a family. So because of his enthusiasm, we decided to start trying for a baby shortly after getting married. We tried for a long time, but after several months without success, we began to suspect that something might be wrong and decided to get tested. Unfortunately, it turned out that I was infertile. It was a big shock for both of us, but more so for my parents, who were disappointed and didn't even bother to hide it. The day we told them, my dad actually walked out instead of consoling me. We decided to stop trying for a while, and Scott and I discussed trying other methods, like IVF. But that would cost a lot, and success on the first try wasn't even guaranteed. So, we had to put our plans to start a family on hold for a while, until we could save enough money to afford multiple rounds of IVF. We were okay with that, although we were a little upset, but my parents were extremely unhappy. They stopped visiting me, stopped talking to me, and no matter how much I tried to explain that it wasn't exactly my fault, they just wouldn't listen. And after a few weeks, I felt so disappointed by their behavior that I called them and told them what I thought. I told them that they had been treating me too cruelly just because I couldn't give them a grandchild at that moment, and it made me doubt whether they could even be good grandparents when I actually could have a child. I told them they had treated me harshly my whole life, just because I wasn't a boy, and I could see how they treated my husband differently. For a long time, I had tried to ignore all that and maintain our relationship, but now I wasn't interested in staying in touch with them. I'd appreciate it if they stayed away from me forever. It was very hard for me to do that because for a long time, I wanted nothing more than their approval, but now I realized it was practically impossible. Instead of apologizing, they decided to double down on what they were doing and were fine with me, never speaking to them again, because, according to them, I wasn't worth anything as a woman since I couldn't have children, and they wanted nothing to do with me. It hurt to hear them say that, but at least I knew where I stood with them. After that call, I really didn't talk to my parents again, and our relationship was over. When I told Scott about that call, he was very understanding at first, but after a few days, I started noticing that even his behavior toward me was changing. At first, I ignored it because I was already going through a very difficult time mentally. So I didn't want to admit that maybe even my husband was going to leave me. I started pretending that nothing was happening and that everything was fine. But within a few months, he had become a completely different person and was really cold toward me all the time. I did everything I could to save our relationship, putting in all the effort I could, but it didn't help. And after 3 months, he came home with divorce papers and said he was done with me. I couldn't say I was surprised, but I still tried to reason with him, telling him that we could always try to have a baby later. But he told me there were too many issues. He wanted to leave behind, and he simply didn't want to be involved in them anymore. He wanted this to end as soon as possible because it was difficult for both of us. The divorce took almost 7 months to finalize, and those were the hardest months of my life. I was completely alone and truly fell apart. To make matters worse, a couple of weeks after he told me he wanted a divorce and moved out, I found out through some relatives that Scott was apparently living with my parents. I thought speaking with them might help, so I decided to talk to his parents about it. It was a very uncomfortable conversation, but they told me that my parents had apparently been in contact with Scott over the past few months. I suppose they had been manipulating him to leave me or something along those lines, which is likely why Scott decided to walk away. Even though his parents didn't think it was a good idea, he had argued with them and was no longer speaking to them. I don't know the exact details of what my parents said to Scott, but I remember his parents telling me that Scott had hinted that my own parents had told him he's someone better. I'm still not entirely sure what exactly they told him, but I guess they were desperate to have a grandchild no matter what. Since I was no longer speaking to them, they couldn't expect a grandchild from me either, and they soon decided to take Scott under their wing and get him to leave me. After my divorce, I was left utterly broken, and it took me several months to recover, but I managed to pull through. Since then, I haven't looked back and have done everything I could to forget the past and move on. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs, got a new job, changed my appearance, and blocked my parents and Scott on social media. I also told all my old friends and relatives that I didn't want to hear anything about them ever again, and that I didn't want them to know anything about me either. Everyone respected that, and for the past 3 years, I've been in therapy and living quite well. The only thing that had been bothering me was the absence of a baby because even though I no longer had a husband or parents, I still wanted to have a child. I felt I was ready to be a mother. Last year, I began IVF treatments and got pregnant with the help of an anonymous donor, and 4 months ago, I gave birth to my baby girl. Life has been pretty great since her birth, and I'm truly happy. 4 days ago, I was out walking on the street with her when I ran into my parents and Scott. At first, I was extremely shocked to see them on my street and thought they were here to see me. But I realized they were coming out of a house a couple streets away. When they saw me, I froze completely and should have turned back home, but I simply didn't have the strength to move. So they approached me, greeted me, and immediately asked about the baby. Since according to them, I was infertile, I answered them, honestly. By then, I processed what was happening and had started heading back home. But Scott stopped me and said he was really glad he had run into me because he'd been thinking about me a lot recently. Apparently, they had come to visit his aunt, who had recently moved into this neighborhood. Scott thought that meeting me was a sign from the universe that he should fix things with me and give our relationship a second chance. My parents were also there and insisted that I invite them home so we could talk about everything that had been happening in my life, since they had clearly missed out on so much. Honestly, I was horrified that they were saying all of this and truly thought I would invite them after everything that had happened. It had taken me 3 whole years to get over this, and I'm still in therapy trying to work through my feelings. So, I had a bit of a meltdown. I told them I'd rather invite a pack of bloodthirsty animals into my home than them because even they would be better. I told them to stop acting and pretending they cared about what was going on in my life, because the only reason they wanted to talk to me now was because I had a baby. My parents wanted to talk to me because they were finally going to get a grandchild, and Scott wanted to talk to me because, obviously, he hadn't been able to find anyone else. He thought that since I had managed to get pregnant once, it wouldn't be a problem to get pregnant again, and he could worm his way back into my life. It was disgusting that all they saw in me was a source of a baby and not a real person with real feelings. They had all abandoned me when I needed them most for emotional support. While I expected this from my parents, because since childhood, they had made it very clear they would have much preferred a son in that. In their view, a woman's only value was defined by whether or not she could become a mother. The real shock had been Scott. He had spent so many years with me and had even comforted me. But despite all that, he had aligned himself with what my parents said for some twisted reason and left me when I was at my lowest point. I hadn't forgotten any of the things they said to me, so I simply repeated them back to them. Since I was useless as a woman, and Scott deserved something better, maybe they should just leave me alone now. Honestly, I've always been a very quiet and shy person, but when they confronted me on the street that day, I was screaming at them at the top of my lungs. It was 3 years of pent-up rage coming out all at once, so it got pretty nasty. Once I was done yelling at them, I headed back to my house and shut the door as quickly as I could. I felt extremely shaken after that, so I decided not to go to work for a couple of days and have been home with my baby since then. My interaction with my parents and Scott had been playing over and over in my head like a loop. Honestly, I didn't know what to do about it until last night when I got a call from an unknown number. I don't know why, as I usually don't answer calls from numbers I don't recognize. But yesterday, I decided to pick up. It was Scott on the other end, and in the background, I could hear my parents whispering. I'm pretty sure they weren't even trying to be discreet. They actually wanted me to know they were there. Anyway, I tried not to let it affect me too much. I just told him I didn't want him calling me again because otherwise I'd be forced to take preventive action against him, and I didn't want to do that. I told him the same applied to my parents. I didn't want to have anything to do with them, and the only reason I had picked up the call was to let them know I was done. I had been done 3 years ago, and I was going to stick to that, but Scott asked me to listen to him, and despite myself, I couldn't hang up, so I let him speak. He told me he knew he had made mistakes, and so had my parents, but it had all come from a place of disappointment. He said that both my parents and he had really been looking forward to starting a family and having a baby in the family. Finding out I was infertile, and that I wasn't even willing to go through IVF until we had enough money had been hard for them to accept, and they hadn't handled it in the best way possible. But now, they really wanted me to give them a second chance to prove they were worthy of being part of my family. After a few seconds, I told him I didn't believe any of the nonsense they were trying to sell me. They wouldn't have cared if they hadn't seen me with the baby that day. And that was the crux of the matter. That was the truth, and I was tired of them pretending it wasn't. Then I was about to hang up. But my parents chimed in from the background and said that was exactly the kind of behavior that had caused them to cut me off. Apparently, they believed I had been very selfish and only thought of myself when I found out I was infertile. Instead of giving them space, I kept forcing my presence on them and trying to get them to comfort me and pay attention to me all the time, even though they themselves were struggling with the news. That's why they all ended up pushing me away, which is how I ended up in the position of having no one for myself. I didn't continue the conversation after that. I just hung up. I really know that they were just trying to manipulate me. Edit 1. Many people wanted to know why my parents didn't try to have another baby after I was born if they wanted a son so badly. Well, my mom had to deal with a lot of complications during her first pregnancy, and the doctors suggested waiting a couple of years before trying for another. But even when she had me, she was in her mid-30s. Waiting a few more years would have meant waiting until her late 30s, which would have made the pregnancy even riskier. Just like I struggled a lot to conceive and eventually found out I was infertile, my mom also struggled a lot to conceive me. The only difference was that when she was struggling, it was her mother-in-law who was unkind to her. Was time with me, it was my own mom who couldn't think of me. Anyway, that's why they couldn't have another child and ended up with just me, a daughter. Edit 2. I don't know exactly what kind of relationship Scott had with his parents, but from what I observed, they seemed to get along quite well. At this point, I don't know if they've managed to reconcile after the last conflict they had, as I haven't kept in touch with his parents and obviously haven't spoken to Scott about it. But Scott is an only child, so he definitely didn't have any competition. Whenever I visited his parents, I could see that they genuinely loved him and had treated him well since his childhood. So I really have no idea why he latched onto my parents the way he did. At least with my parents, I knew they wanted a son, which is why they started treating Scott the way they did. But with him, I had no idea what went wrong. Over the past 3 years, I've just been trying to forget all of this, so I hadn't really thought about or questioned it. But now that people are mentioning it, I feel like I need to talk to my ex-in-laws and get to the bottom of this, even if it's just out of curiosity. Anyway, I hope this clears up any questions people might have. Update 1. I decided to talk to my ex-in-laws to figure out why exactly Scott had behaved the way he did. Honestly, I couldn't think of any reason why he'd need to visit his aunt with my parents. That was just strange. I already knew it wasn't my fault. They abandoned me when I needed them the most because they are terrible people, and I knew they were just trying to manipulate me. I just wanted some peace of mind and didn't want to bother my friends with this since it's very personal, which is why I posted here. So, thank you very much to everyone who gave me reassurance and made sure I knew I wasn't the bad guy in this story. Anyway, it was quite awkward to reach out to my ex-in-laws after 3 years of no contact, because the last time I spoke to them was around the time of the divorce. But fortunately, they were pretty happy to hear from me. After a bit of small talk, I decided to get straight to the point and ask them why exactly Scott was so close to my parents and whether they had been in contact with him or not. They told me that a few months after their last fight, they had actually managed to reconcile with Scott and were in touch with him at that time. However, he had also kept in contact with my parents. They told me Scott had been loved as a child, so it wasn't as if he was trying to replace his parents with mine. Apparently, my parents had been quite suspicious from the start of our relationship. They tried to win his sympathy even while we were dating. Scott would tell his parents that my parents occasionally invited him over for dinner, even when I was busy, and he would go spend time with them on his own. He thought this was something to brag about because he believed he had impressed my parents just by being himself. This was true because he was a man, and that was enough to impress my parents. So they had already spent a lot of time alone with him without me knowing. He had started to see them as parental figures, although he also respected his own parents. It was really complicated. Plus, my parents constantly showered him with expensive gifts and wrote him checks all the time. That's the money Scott had offered to use for IVU when we were together. I thought he was joking because at the time, we didn't have that kind of money, and I didn't want him to do anything shady for it. He didn't want to tell me he had received a lot of money from my parents, because then he'd have to confess the kind of relationship he had with them. But even after that, I refused to do IVF because I didn't think we had the money and wanted to save up. That's what my parents used to manipulate him and tell him he deserved someone better, someone who trusted him. Eventually, within a few months, they managed to brainwash him, and that's how he ended up leaving me. My ex-in-laws apologized to me for this, but they also explained that even though they didn't agree with the kind of relationship Scott had with my parents, he was their only son, so they couldn't cut ties with him either. I don't blame them. They don't owe me anything, and they were just kind enough to tell me the truth. But now that I know the truth, I have no reason to entertain my parents if they try to contact me. They're repugnant people and not worth my time. I finally decided to return to work after taking almost 2 weeks off. Thankfully, I still had plenty of days left from my maternity leave, as I hadn't taken the full 6 months at once, and my company's policy is quite flexible. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, whom I trust completely. She has great references, and I know her personally. She's a really good person. Midway through the workday, I received a call from her. She immediately informed me that she had decided to take my daughter to her house because she wasn't sure if staying at my house was safe due to my ex-husband. I agreed that she could take her there for safety, and I called the police while rushing back home. On the call, she told me Scott had been outside for a few minutes, yelling for me to come out. When he realized I wasn't there, he began trying to break down the door, cursing loudly, which made my daughter cry. The nanny acted quickly, called me so I could alert the police, and managed to leave through the back door, walking to her house through the garden gate since she lived only a few minutes away. This way, my baby would be safe, while I dealt with my ex-husband and the police. Honestly, I'm so grateful that she prioritized my daughter's safety and well-being. That's how it should be. When I got home, the police were already there, and it was obvious Scott had been drinking. It was strange because it was around noon, a weird time to be drunk. But there he was. I decided to press charges against him because I was truly furious and wanted him gone. This also gave me a reason to get a restraining order against him since he was clearly losing control. They managed to take him away, and a few minutes later, my nanny came back with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off because I planned to stay home with my daughter. I suppose I'll need to take a couple more days off work, but I'm not complaining since I get to spend time with my favorite person. Update 3. It's been a couple of weeks since my last update. I've been busy taking care of my baby and have also decided to start a new project, which has been pretty exciting. Here's the situation with my parents and Scott. I was able to get the restraining order against Scott, fortunately. It wasn't much trouble because I had security footage from the day he showed up drunk and caused a scene when he found out I wasn't home. The footage is from my neighbor, but as they suggested, I should install my own cameras, something I plan to do. Sometimes I laugh, thinking Reddit must have some contract with companies that sell cameras, because that's often the most popular advice. I guess my parents saw their situation and decided not to bother me, so they've stayed away. My ex-in-laws informed me that after what happened to me, they decided to cut ties with Scott. Apparently, he's been struggling to find other women even though he desperately wants to start a family. He can't do it without a partner, and he doesn't like the idea of adoption. Maybe that explains his recent behavior, but that doesn't mean I have to forgive him, especially after everything he put me through, including involving my parents. That said, they're still trying to badmouth me to my relatives, which is sad because it's clearly not working. Everyone knows they were the ones who did the worst possible things and are now trying to play the victims. That's not how it works, and they're learning it the hard way. I'm glad they'll never be able to have contact with their granddaughter. I simply won't allow it. My daughter and I are going to live a wonderful life together, without anyone bothering us. Without a doubt, I'll be a much better mother than the one I had as an example. Update for this update is somewhat funny, because it shows my parents' true colors, although I think we already knew them. So far, they hadn't contacted me because they were blocked everywhere. Additionally, according to their words, they were ashamed to come to my house to talk to me, something Scott didn't seem to feel, based on everything he did. By the way, I haven't heard anything from him in quite some time. I have a restraining order, in case you haven't read my updates, and that seems to be working for now. But anyway, my parents came to my house over the weekend. Today is Wednesday, but I waited a bit longer to see if they tried anything else. When I opened the door just to tell them to leave, they said they just wanted to meet my child. I emphasize child because that's the word they used. You see, they only saw my daughter the day I ran into them by chance, and I don't usually dress my daughter in pink or feminine clothes. She often wears pretty neutral clothing. After all, she's a baby. She does have some pink things, but I'm not like those TV moms who dress their daughters all in pink. So my parents thought she was a boy, which doesn't make much sense since she wasn't dressed as one either. My daughter is only a few months old, so you also can't tell by her face whether she's a girl or a boy. Anyway, when they said child, I corrected them and told them she was my daughter. They looked confused, like I'd shattered their entire illusion. They went on to say they were ashamed to come talk to me after so long, but now wanted to meet their grandson, and again referred to her as a boy. This time, I didn't correct them because I realized what was going on. They continued to say that, after Scott's behavior, they had cut ties with him and just wanted to repair the relationship with me. They also asked if the baby was home so they could see him and had even bought some gifts. And yes, they were toys for boys in blue clothes and things like that. They left them by the door when they left, and now I don't know what to do with them. I'll probably donate them or give them to a friend who does have a boy. If her son is into those things, her child is a bit older than my daughter. When they were done, I asked, "Do you really want to meet my daughter?" Because she's a girl, not a boy. My mother said, but the other day she wasn't wearing pink, to which I replied something similar to what I've explained here. After that, they said they could meet her, but you could tell by their tone they weren't very convinced. I told them she was sleeping now, but that they could come back in a couple of hours when it was feeding time. They said they would. But I haven't heard from them since. I think they only said they wanted to meet her anyway. Because it was all so awkward, but when they found out she was a girl, they basically stopped bothering me. I'm not sure what I would have done if they had actually come back, as I wasn't serious about formally introducing them to my daughter. I have no interest in them being in their granddaughter's life. Deep down, I knew this could be their reaction, so I'm not surprised. Almost 2 months have passed since what happened in this post, and no, I haven't heard from my parents. I guess I was right.